For as long as Henry Cole could remember, he had loved objects with a history. As the owner of Cole's Curiosities, a dusty antique shop tucked away on a quiet side street, he spent his days surrounded by relics of other people's lives. That's why he didn't think twice when a weathered old man shuffled into the shop one rainy afternoon, carrying a wooden crate wrapped in fraying rope. The man's hands shook as he set the box on the counter, his eyes darting nervously around the store. "You buy old things?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. Henry glanced at the crate. It reeked of mildew, and the faint smell of varnish and rotting wood made his nose wrinkle. But curiosity outweighed his hesitation. "Depends," Henry said, gesturing toward the box. "What's in there?" The old man's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Marionettes. Old ones. They're unique." Henry raised an eyebrow but began untying the rope. The wood of the crate was soft and damp, splinters peeling away as he pried it open. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were 6 marionettes. Each was grotesque in its craftsmanship, wooden faces painted with sharp, exaggerated features. One had a permanent sneer, its teeth bared in a grin that stretched too wide. Another's eyes were sunken and dark, as though its sockets went too deep. Their clothes were faded, stitched with intricate, decaying patterns. "There, something," Henry said, carefully lifting one out. Its limbs dangled limply, the strings tangled like cobwebs. "Where did you find these?" The old man shifted uncomfortably. "They found me," he muttered. Henry looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid a hand across the counter, his fingers trembling. $50 for the lot. Just take them. Get them out of here." Henry hesitated. It wasn't unusual for people to unload old, unwanted items, but something about the man's desperation unsettled him. Still, a deal was a deal. "Fine," Henry said, pulling a few bills from the register. He placed the money in the man's hand, but the man didn't move. "Don't hang them," the man said suddenly, his voice sharp. "What?" "Don't hang them up. Don't tie their strings." Henry frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" The old man didn't answer. He turned and shuffled out of the store, the door's bell jingling faintly behind him. That night, long after closing, Henry carried the crate to the back room. He spent a while examining the marionettes, his unease giving way to fascination. Despite their unsettling appearance, the craftsmanship was remarkable. Their joints moved smoothly, and the detail on their faces was intricate, almost lifelike. He couldn't resist the urge to display them. Ignoring the old man's warning, he untangled the strings of one marionette and hung it from a wooden stand near the window. Its head tilted slightly, its dark eyes staring out into the shop. Satisfied, Henry turned off the lights and locked the door behind him. That night, he dreamed of strings. They stretched out in every direction, endless and frayed. They pulled at him, binding his arms and legs, wrapping around his neck like a noose. He couldn't move. Somewhere in the darkness, laughter echoed, high-pitched and hollow, like the creak of wood. He woke in a cold sweat, his chest heaving. The dream clung to him, a weight in the pit of his stomach. Shaking it off, he got dressed and returned to the shop. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air felt wrong. He flipped on the lights, and his blood ran cold. The marionette he'd hung near the window was no longer dangling from its strings. It was standing on the counter. Its wooden head had turned to face him, its dark eyes glinting in the fluorescent light. Henry froze in the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. The marionette stood upright on the counter, its wooden limbs slightly bent, as though it had climbed there on its own. "That's impossible," he muttered, stepping cautiously toward it. The strings hung limply from its joints, tangled in a pile at its feet. Its painted grin seemed wider now, the jagged edges of its teeth catching the light in a way that made Henry's skin crawl. He reached out to pick it up, but stopped short, the memory of the old man's warning echoing in his head. "Don't tie their strings." A soft creak behind him made him whirl around. One of the other marionettes, still inside the crate, had shifted slightly, its head now tilted toward him. "Get a grip," Henry said to himself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. He grabbed the marionette on the counter and shoved it back into the crate, slamming the lid shut. The day passed uneventfully, though the unease lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow in the shop made Henry jump. By evening, he convinced himself that he'd imagined it. Exhaustion from the late nights, stress from running the shop, it all added up. But when he locked up that night, he couldn't stop himself from glancing at the crate before he left. It hadn't moved. The next morning, Henry entered the shop to find the crate wide open. His stomach dropped. He was certain he'd closed it, even tied it shut with the same rope it had come with. The marionettes were scattered across the floor, their tangled strings stretched out like cobwebs. "No," he whispered, stepping inside. As he bent to gather them, he felt a tug on his arm. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he turned his head. One of the marionettes, the one with sunken eyes, had its wooden hand wrapped around his sleeve. Henry stumbled back with a cry, pulling his arm free. The marionette flopped lifelessly to the ground, its hand still outstretched. He stared at it, his mind racing. "This can't be happening," he muttered. He grabbed a broom and swept the marionettes into the corner, piling them into a haphazard heap. Then he dragged the crate over and shoved them inside, slamming the lid shut. For good measure, he grabbed a roll of duct tape and sealed the crate completely. "Let's see you get out of that," he said, his voice shaking. That night, Henry dreamed again. He was in the shop, but it was dark and cold. The shelves were empty, the room silent. He felt something tugging at his arms and legs, pulling him in different directions. Looking down, he saw strings attached to his wrists and ankles. They tightened as he struggled, digging into his skin. From the shadows, the marionettes emerged. Their limbs moved jerkily, and their hollow eyes glinted with malice. "You're part of the game now," one of them rasped, its voice splintered and hollow. Henry woke with a gasp, his heart pounding. His arms felt heavy, and for a moment, he swore he could feel the phantom pressure of strings pulling at him. When he arrived at the shop the next morning, the crate was empty again. The marionettes were hanging in the air, their strings tied to the ceiling beams. They swayed slightly, as though caught in a breeze. Henry stepped. Henry stared at the marionettes, swaying gently in the still air. Their strings stretched taut, disappearing into the shadows above the ceiling beams. "What?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The marionette with the sneering grin hung closest, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow him as he edged closer. The pile of duct tape he'd used to seal the crate lay discarded on the floor, as though it had been peeled away by unseen hands. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but the marionettes held his gaze, their lifeless forms radiating a sinister energy. "Who's doing this?" Henry demanded, his voice trembling. "Who's in here?" A faint creak echoed from the far corner of the shop. Henry turned, his breath catching in his throat. One of the marionettes, a smaller one with chipped paint and an eerie, childlike face, had untangled itself and dropped to the floor. It stood upright, its wooden limbs jerking unnaturally, as though testing their range of motion. Henry backed away, his legs shaky. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself. "It's a prank. It has to be." But the marionette took a halting step forward, its strings trailing behind it like the tendrils of a spider's web. "Stop," Henry said, his voice a shaky whisper. The marionette froze mid-step. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the rapid thud of Henry's heartbeat. Then, its head jerked upward, its hollow gaze locking onto his. "You shouldn't have touched us," it rasped, its voice splintered and hollow, like wood scraping against stone. Henry bolted for the door, his pulse roaring in his ears. His hand fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't turn. The metal was cold, unyielding, as though frozen in place. Behind him, he heard the faint click of wooden limbs moving across the floor. When he turned, the marionette was gone. But the others, still suspended from the ceiling, had turned their heads to face him. "Leave me alone!" Henry shouted, his voice cracking. The marionettes swayed in unison, their strings creaking like old wood. Henry grabbed a metal crowbar from behind the counter and swung it at the nearest marionette. The impact shattered the wooden body, splinters flying across the room. For a moment, he felt relief. But as he turned to the others, the fragments of the shattered marionette began to move. The broken pieces dragged themselves across the floor, clicking and scraping as they reassembled. The head rolled into place, its sneering grin even wider than before. "Why are you doing this?" Henry screamed, swinging the crowbar again. But the marionettes didn't answer. They didn't need to. That night, Henry didn't go home. He barricaded himself in the shop's back room, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. He clutched the crowbar like a lifeline, but deep down, he knew it was useless. The strings were everywhere now. Thin and nearly invisible, they crisscrossed the room like a spider's web. When he moved, he felt them brush against his skin, their faint tugging sending chills down his spine. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion overtook him. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, slumped against the wall. He dreamed of the marionettes. They surrounded him, their strings wrapping around his wrists and ankles, pulling him to his feet. His limbs moved against his will, jerking and twisting like a puppet on a stage. In the center of the room stood the sneering marionette, its hollow eyes burning with malice. "Your strings are ours now," it rasped. Henry woke with a start, gasping for air. But the nightmare hadn't ended. His arms and legs felt heavy, as though bound by invisible cords. When he tried to move, his body responded sluggishly, as though controlled by something else. From the shop's main room, he heard the faint creak of strings being pulled tight. And then, the sound of laughter, high-pitched and hollow. Henry's heart raced as he staggered to his feet, his movements sluggish and unnatural. Every step felt like wading through syrup, his limbs responding not to his will but to an unseen force tugging at him. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The laughter grew louder, echoing from the shop's main room. High-pitched and mocking, it sounded like dozens of voices all layered together. Summoning what little courage he had left, Henry gripped the crowbar and pushed open the door to the shop floor. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The marionettes were no longer hanging limply from the ceiling. They moved freely now, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they prowled the room. The sneering marionette stood at the center, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Above them, strings stretched into the darkness, disappearing into the ceiling beams. They writhed and twisted like living things, tightening and coiling as though preparing for something. "You touched our strings," the sneering marionette rasped, its head tilting sharply to one side. "Now we'll touch yours." Henry stumbled back, but his feet caught on something, and he fell hard onto the floor. Looking down, he saw them, strings. Thin, glimmering strands were wrapped around his wrists and ankles, pulling taut against the floorboards. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "This isn't real." The strings tightened, dragging him forward. He clawed at the floor, trying to resist, but the force was too strong. His legs jerked unnaturally, his arms twisting as though they were no longer his own. The marionettes surrounded him, their heads cocked at unnatural angles as they watched him struggle. "Let me go!" Henry screamed, his voice raw with panic. The sneering marionette stepped closer, its wooden face inches from his. "You're part of the game now," it hissed. "We pull the strings, and you dance." Henry's body convulsed as the strings yanked him upright. His arms and legs moved on their own, jerking violently as though controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. He tried to resist, but every attempt only tightened the strings, sending sharp, searing pain through his limbs. The marionettes began to mimic his movements. When he flailed, so did they. When he tried to scream, their hollow mouths opened wide, releasing a chorus of mocking laughter. It was like watching a grotesque mirror, their wooden bodies contorting in exaggerated mimicry of his every action. "Why are you doing this?" Henry gasped, tears streaming down his face. The sneering marionette tilted its head, its grin widening. "You took us out of the box. You hung our strings. Now, you're ours to play." The room spun as the strings dragged Henry toward the center of the shop. The marionettes moved around him in a grotesque dance, their limbs jerking and twisting. From above, the strings began to descend in earnest, looping around his arms, his legs, his torso. He felt them tighten, biting into his skin, pulling him upward until his feet no longer touched the floor. Suspended in the air, Henry's body moved against his will, jerking and twisting like a puppet on display. "No," he cried, his voice breaking. "Please, stop." But the marionettes only laughed, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. "You're one of us now," the sneering marionette said. "And soon, you'll learn how to pull the strings too." The lights in the shop flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. Henry's movements became more erratic, his body lurching painfully as the strings yanked him into a grotesque dance. His vision blurred, and a strange sensation crept over him, a numbness that started in his fingers and toes, spreading slowly through his limbs. Looking down, he saw his skin changing. His fingers stiffened, their color fading to a pale, varnished hue. His joints ached as they locked into place, his movements becoming less human with each passing second. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This can't be happening." The marionettes surrounded him, their laughter fading into a low, rhythmic chant. Strings wrapped tighter around him, pulling him higher, as his body continued to transform. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the shop window. His face was stiff, his features unnaturally smooth and wooden. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared back at him with a mocking grin. He wasn't becoming a puppet. He already was. Henry's mind screamed in protest, but his body no longer obeyed him. The strings moved him effortlessly, pulling his wooden limbs into grotesque, unnatural positions. The marionettes surrounding him chanted in a language he couldn't understand, their voices hollow and rhythmic, echoing through the shop. Suspended in the air, he could feel the last remnants of his humanity slipping away. His joints ached as they locked into place, his thoughts growing sluggish, heavy. "Let me go," he managed to choke out, though his voice sounded wrong, splintered and hollow, like the creak of a rusty hinge. The sneering marionette stepped closer, its strings writhing as though alive. Its head tilted sharply, its painted grin wide and malicious. "You're one of us now," it rasped. "But every puppet needs a master." Henry's body jerked violently, his arms and legs twisting as though testing their new form. The strings around him tightened, pulling him higher until he hung just below the ceiling beams. From this height, he could see the shop floor below, the other marionettes watching him with unblinking eyes. "Please," he whispered, though the words felt foreign, distant. The sneering marionette turned its hollow gaze upward, its grin fading for the first time. "It's time," it said simply. The strings above Henry began to stretch, winding tighter and tighter until they vanished into the shadows of the ceiling. A cold, suffocating silence fell over the room. Then, the pull began. It started as a faint tug, an almost imperceptible force pulling at the back of Henry's mind. But it grew stronger, sharper, until it felt as though his thoughts were being unraveled, piece by piece. Images of his life flashed before him, his shop, his friends, his childhood. Each memory flickered and dimmed, replaced by a growing void. "Stop," he tried to shout, but the strings tightened around his throat, silencing him. The sneering marionette grinned again. "You'll forget soon enough. They all do." The transformation was complete. Henry's body was no longer his own, wooden, hollow, controlled by unseen hands. His thoughts, his will, his very identity had been consumed by the strings. But then, something shifted. As the pull grew stronger, Henry felt something else, a new connection, a strange awareness. The strings no longer felt like chains. They felt like extensions of himself. The room came into sharper focus. The marionettes below no longer moved freely, they hung limply, their strings slack. The sneering marionette, once so confident, now looked up at him with something that resembled fear. "What are you doing?" it rasped, its voice trembling. Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. The strings above him pulsed with energy, and the shadows in the room seemed to ripple. Henry raised one wooden hand, and the marionettes below jerked violently, their limbs moving against their will. The sneering marionette let out a sharp cry. "Stop! You don't know what you're." Henry clenched his hand into a fist, and the marionette string snapped, its body collapsing into a lifeless heap. The shop grew silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Henry looked down at the other marionettes, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They no longer seemed menacing, only afraid. He could feel the power coursing through the strings, the connection that bound them all together. For the first time, he understood. Weeks later, Cole's Curiosities remained closed, its windows dark and its door locked tight. Inside, the shop was eerily still. The marionettes sat neatly on their shelves, their strings tied in perfect, taut lines. But if anyone had ventured inside, they might have noticed the newest addition to the collection, a marionette with Henry's face, its wooden grin frozen in a perpetual sneer. And above it, stretching into the darkness of the ceiling beams, were strings that moved ever so slightly, as though waiting for a new master to pull them. For now, Henry was in control. But the strings always found someone new.